The rain had just begun to slick the asphalt of the Oak Ridge Country Club's sweeping driveway when the contrast between two worlds became impossible to ignore. Oak Ridge was a monument to old money and carefully curated prestige, its limestone facade illuminated by soft, expensive floodlights that cast a golden glow over the manicured lawns. On this particular evening, the air was thick with the scent of burning high-octane fuel, expensive perfume, and the distinct, intoxicating hum of wealth. It was the 10-year reunion for the graduating class of Great Oaks Academy, an elite private school where fortunes were inherited and futures were predetermined. The driveway was a moving showroom of modern luxury. Sleek, low-slung Italian sports cars purred in the valet line, their carbon fiber bodies gleaming under the canopy. Impeccably polished German SUVs discharged passengers wrapped in silk, cashmere, and diamonds. Everyone who arrived was an actor in a grand theater of mutual admiration, desperate to prove that the last decade had been a trajectory of unbridled success. Then came the disruption to the symphony of wealth. A sharp, rhythmic metallic rattle echoed down the stone-paved driveway, drawing the immediate attention of the valets and the early arrivals lingering near the grand entrance. A fading, rusted 2005 sedan rounded the bend. Its silver paint was peeling in jagged patches like sunburned skin, and a deep, jagged dent scarred the entire passenger side from the front fender to the rear door. The engine gasped and coughed, emitting a faint puff of gray smoke as it finally shuddered to a halt at the front of the line. The young valet hesitated, looking at the vehicle with a mixture of disgust and confusion, as if unsure whether he was legally allowed to touch it. The driver's door groaned loudly as it was pushed open. Out stepped Arthur. He was a quiet, unassuming man of 28, possessing a posture that was neither defensive nor aggressive, but entirely still. He wore a simple, navy blue suit that had clearly seen better days. The cuffs were slightly frayed, the fabric across the shoulders was worn thin from years of use, and his leather shoes, though clean, bore the unmistakable creases of thousands of miles of walking. To the untrained eye, Arthur looked like a man who had been thoroughly crushed by the gears of the economy, a forgotten casualty of a ruthless world. He handed his keys to the reluctant valet with a polite nod, ignoring the whispers that had already begun to ripple through the crowd gathered under the awning. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was a stifling fog of superficiality. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant fracture of light over ice sculptures, champagne towers, and hundreds of alumni dressed in bespoke evening wear. Standing at the epicenter of the room was Julian. Julian had been the golden boy of Great Oaks Academy, a predatory apex predator in a tailored Italian tux whose arrogance had only magnified with age. Today, he was a prominent real estate developer, a man whose face adorned billboards across the city, known for his aggressive acquisitions and ruthless gentrification. Surrounded by his old high school lackeys, Marcus, a sycophantic corporate lawyer, and Chloe, a status-obsessed socialite, Julian was holding court, loudly regaling the group with the details of his latest multi-million-dollar penthouse acquisition. Julian's laughter stopped mid-breath as his eyes scanned the room and locked onto Arthur, who had just entered and was standing near the periphery, quietly observing the opulence. A malicious, familiar gleam ignited in Julian's eyes. It was the same look he had possessed in the high school hallways whenever he spotted a target too weak to fight back. He nudged Marcus, pointing a glass of vintage champagne toward the door. Within moments, Julian and his entourage had navigated the crowded floor, cutting a path directly toward Arthur. The music seemed to fade, replaced by a sudden, tense quiet as the surrounding alumni realized a spectacle was about to unfold. Julian stopped just 3 feet from Arthur, his chest puffed out, a mocking smirk plastered across his tanned face. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he slowly looked Arthur up and down, making a theatrical show of examining the frayed cuffs and the cheap, scuffed shoes. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Julian announced, his voice booming across the immediate radius so that everyone could hear. "Class of 2016, we have a miracle. Arthur actually made it. Tell me, Artie, did you have to take 3 different city buses to get here, or did you legally park that biohazard I saw rolling up the driveway?" Marcus let out a loud, performative bark of laughter, instantly pulling his smartphone from his pocket. He raised the camera, aiming it directly at Arthur's face, turning on the bright LED flash to record the encounter for his social media followers. "Come on, Julian, go easy on him," Marcus sneered, his eyes glued to his phone screen. "Maybe he's the new janitor here." "Arthur, did you come to clean up the champagne glasses, or are you actually pretending to be an alumnus?" Arthur didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. The blinding light of the smartphone camera reflected in his calm, steady eyes. He didn't look down in shame, nor did his jaw clench in anger. His face was a mask of absolute, unreadable serenity. He absorbed the insults, the flashing lights, and the mocking stares of dozens of former classmates who had gathered around to watch the humiliation. To them, his silence was a confirmation of defeat. They assumed he was paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own insignificance. Julian took a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space, the scent of expensive cologne and alcohol washing over the quiet man. "Seriously, Arthur, look at you," Julian continued, his tone dripping with a cruel, patronizing pity. 10 years later, and you're still wearing the same garbage clothes, still living a garbage life. Some people are just born to be the backdrop of other people's success. You should have stayed home, man. This room is for people who actually built something. People who matter. Look around you. Everyone here is a mover, a shaker, a millionaire. And you're just a ghost. A ghost in a bad suit. A few people in the crowd giggled nervously, while others simply watched with cold indifference. Nobody stepped in to defend Arthur. In the high society world of Great Oaks, weakness was a contagious disease, and no one wanted to be infected by standing too close to a pariah. Arthur simply looked at Julian, his gaze lingering on the developer's flushed face for a long, quiet moment. "Thank you for the warm welcome, Julian," Arthur said softly, his voice remarkably steady, devoid of any tremor of hurt or resentment. "I hope the rest of your evening is as unforgettable as you expect it to be." Julian let out a dismissive snort, clearly disappointed by the lack of a dramatic reaction. He tapped Marcus on the shoulder, signaling him to lower the camera. "Boring as always," Julian muttered, turning his back on Arthur with total disregard. "Come on, guys, let's go back to the VIP lounge. I have a major business merger to finalize tonight, and I don't want to waste my energy on charity cases." As Julian walked away, his loud laughter echoing toward the bar, Arthur remained exactly where he was. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a plain white handkerchief, and casually wiped a stray droplet of condensation from his sleeve. If anyone had been paying close attention to his eyes, they would have seen something terrifying. There was no sadness in them. There was only the cold, calculated precision of an executioner waiting for the clock to strike the appointed hour. What Julian and his inner circle didn't realize was that the glittering facade of their lives was entirely hollow. While Julian spent the next hour drinking heavily and boasting about his invincible empire, a dark, suffocating reality was closing in on him from the shadows. The real estate market had taken a catastrophic downturn over the last fiscal year. Julian had over-leveraged every single one of his properties, borrowing tens of millions of dollars from high-risk secondary lenders to finance a massive commercial plaza project that was currently sitting half-constructed and completely abandoned. He was defaulting on his loans. His corporate accounts were frozen, his creditors were circling like vultures, and his entire empire was an hour away from a catastrophic, public bankruptcy. The same desperation ran through Marcus and Chloe's families. They had all pooled their remaining capital into Julian's mega-development, believing his arrogant promises of guaranteed returns. They were all drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Their only saving grace, their absolute last hope, was a mysterious, legendary entity known only as the Apex Sovereign Fund. Apex was an anonymous, multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm that had recently entered the local market, quietly buying up distressed corporate debts and distressed assets. Julian had spent the last 3 weeks frantically begging the anonymous board of Apex for a $70 million emergency bailout investment. He had been promised that the final decision would be delivered tonight. By the time dinner was served in the grand dining hall, Julian was visibly sweating through his tailored tuxedo. He kept checking his encrypted watch, his eyes darting toward the main entrance of the ballroom with an increasing, feral panic. He had forced the organizers to seat him at the prestigious center table, right beneath the main podium, while Arthur had been relegated to the absolute worst seat in the house, a small, wobbly table in the far back corner, directly next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, where the smell of dish soap and the clatter of dirty silverware were constant. Julian had pointed and laughed at Arthur's seating arrangement earlier, but now, the crushing weight of his own impending ruin was making it difficult to maintain the facade. Halfway through the main course, the ambient chatter of the room was suddenly severed by a heavy, resonant sound. The massive, double-arched mahogany doors at the front of the ballroom were thrown open. The sudden movement drew every eye in the room. A group of 7 individuals marched into the hall. They didn't look like alumni, and they certainly didn't look like partygoers. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized precision of a military unit. At the front were 4 towering, stone-faced security details in matching black suits, earpieces subtly visible. Behind them walked 3 high-powered corporate attorneys, led by an older man with silver hair and a razor-sharp pinstripe suit. He was instantly recognizable to anyone in the upper echelons of finance. It was Harrison Vance, the most ruthless, expensive corporate liquidator in the country, a man whose presence usually signaled the death of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. In his hands, Vance carried a thick, heavy master portfolio bound in black leather, embossed with a minimalist gold seal, the unmistakable insignia of the Apex Sovereign Fund. Julian's heart leaped into his throat. A surge of absolute, desperate euphoria flooded his veins. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the marble floor, knocking over a glass of red wine that stained the white tablecloth like fresh blood. He didn't care. They were here. The Apex Fund had sent Harrison Vance himself to deliver his $70 million salvation contract. Mr. Vance. Julian called out, his voice cracking slightly with a mixture of relief and unbridled arrogance. He quickly smoothed his tuxedo jacket and stepped out from behind his table, projecting his chest. Over here. Table 1. I've been expecting you. We can step into the private conference room right now to sign the bailout paperwork. I assure you, my real estate portfolio is ready for the transition. Harrison Vance stopped walking. His piercing, icy gray eyes locked onto Julian for a fraction of a second. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't even slow his pace. With an expression of total, chilling indifference, Vance walked right past Julian's outstretched hand, completely bypassing him as if the real estate mogul were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture. Julian froze, his hand hanging awkwardly in the air, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. Mr. Vance. He stammered, turning around. The investment team didn't stop. They continued their march down the central aisle of the ballroom, moving past the wealthy, past the influential, past the local politicians and the heirs to old fortunes. They walked straight toward the back of the room. They walked toward the dim, drafty corner next to the kitchen doors. The security details quickly fanned out, forming an impenetrable human wall around the small, wobbly table. Harrison Vance stepped forward, stood directly in front of Arthur, and stopped. The entire ballroom fell into a silence so absolute that the only audible sound was the low hum of the kitchen refrigerators. Harrison Vance, a man who commanded fear in the highest boardrooms of Wall Street, slowly closed his leather portfolio. Then, with a profound, uncharacteristic reverence, he bowed his head deeply to the man in the worn, navy suit. "Good evening, Chairman," Vance said, his voice clear, resonant, and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "The acquisition is complete. As per your direct orders, Apex Sovereign Capital has successfully purchased 100% of the outstanding debt, mortgages, and personal liabilities of Julian Real Estate Holdings and its primary investors. Furthermore, we have officially finalized the purchase of the underlying land and the corporate lease of the Oak Ridge Country Club as of 20 minutes ago. The master portfolio is ready for your signature, sir." The universe seemed to stop spinning for everyone in that room. Julian felt the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ash-gray color. His knees trembled violently, and he had to grip the edge of a nearby table to prevent himself from collapsing entirely. Marcus dropped his fork, the silver clattering loudly against his porcelain plate. The smartphones that had been raised to record Arthur's humiliation were now trembling in the hands of people who suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of a god disguised as a beggar. Arthur calmly picked up his cloth napkin, dabbed his mouth, and stood up. The psychological shift in the room was instantaneous. The quiet, unassuming man who had spent the night absorbing insults suddenly seemed to tower over the entire ballroom. The worn, navy suit no longer looked like a sign of poverty, it looked like the ultimate display of supreme indifference, the casual attire of a man so wealthy he had absolutely nothing to prove to a room full of superficial ghosts. Arthur reached out and took the heavy leather portfolio from Vance's hands. He opened it slowly, the crisp rustle of high-grade legal parchment echoing like a death knell in the silence. He pulled an elegant, matte black fountain pen from his inner pocket, signed his name at the bottom of the document with a fluid, practiced stroke, and handed the portfolio back to his attorney. "Excellent work, Harrison," Arthur said, his voice no longer soft, but carrying a cold, calculated weight that made the air feel suddenly freezing. "Please inform the secondary markets that we will not be restructuring the debt. We will be executing immediate liquidation." Arthur then turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room until it locked directly onto Julian, who looked like a man standing before a firing squad. Arthur walked out from behind his wobbly table, his steps slow, deliberate, and heavy. The crowd of wealthy alumni parted before him like the Red Sea, people literally scrambling backward to avoid getting in his path. He stopped just a few feet away from Julian, looking down at the trembling developer. "You were right about one thing, Julian," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a terrifying, serene malice. "This room is for people who actually built something. The difference is, while you were busy building a fragile house of cards out of arrogance and stolen credit, I was busy buying the wind." "Arthur." "Artie, please," Julian whispered, his voice completely broken, his eyes wide with an absolute, primal terror. He could feel his entire life, his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom slipping away into the abyss. "I didn't know. It was just a joke. We were just messing around, like the old days. We go back 10 years, man. We went to the same school. You can't do this. If you liquidate that debt, my company goes under by midnight. My family loses everything. I'll be completely ruined." Arthur's face remained a mask of absolute stone. He looked at Julian's sweating forehead, then glanced at Marcus and Chloe, who were both pale, weeping silently as they realized their family fortunes had just been eradicated by the man they had filmed for a social media joke. "The old days," Arthur repeated, a cold, dark smile finally touching the corners of his lips. "In the old days, Julian, you taught me a very valuable lesson. You taught me that the strong consume the weak, and that some people are just born to be the backdrop of other people's success. I took your advice to heart. For 10 years, I worked 18 hours a day. I lived in a cramped, drafty apartment, drove a broken car, and poured every single cent I made into building an empire that could never be shaken. I didn't wear an expensive suit tonight because I don't need a piece of Italian fabric to give me authority. My authority is absolute." Arthur stepped closer, his shadow completely engulfing Julian. The psychological dominance was total. Julian looked completely diminished, a small, pathetic boy trapped in an expensive tuxedo that he could no longer afford. "3 weeks ago, your loan applications landed on my desk," Arthur continued, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that cut through Julian's soul. "You begged Apex for a lifeline. You didn't know who I was, because I don't care about billboard advertisements or social media likes. But I knew exactly who you were. I could have denied your request immediately. But I decided to wait. I wanted to see if 10 years had brought you any wisdom, any humility, any humanity. I wanted to give you one final chance to show me that you were something more than a hollow bully. Arthur paused, letting the silence heavy up the room. He pointed a single, calm finger toward Marcus, who was still holding his phone, his hands shaking so badly the camera was capturing a blurred image of the floor. "But instead, you chose to do what you've always done," Arthur said, his tone dropping into a final, merciless verdict. "You chose to humiliate the quiet man. You chose to film it for your friends. You chose to feed your own pathetic ego at the expense of someone else's dignity. You proved to me tonight that you haven't changed at all. And because you haven't changed, your destiny won't change either." Arthur turned away from Julian, looking at Harrison Vance and the security team. "As I mentioned, Harrison, we now own the land and the corporate lease of this country club. And as the sole owner of Apex Sovereign Capital, I find the current guest list of this establishment to be incredibly distasteful." Vance bowed his head. "Understood, Mr. Chairman. What are your orders?" "Evict them," Arthur said coldly, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Evict Julian, Marcus, Chloe, and every single person who laughed at their jokes tonight. Cancel the reunion. Shut down the power, lock the gates, and let them finish their expensive champagne in the rain. They have exactly 5 minutes to clear the premises before my security details forcibly remove them for criminal trespassing." "Arthur. No. Please." Julian shrieked, dropping to his knees on the marble floor, completely abandoning what little pride he had left. He reached out to grab the hem of Arthur's worn trousers, but a towering security guard instantly stepped in between them, slamming a heavy leather boot down just inches from Julian's fingers. Arthur didn't look back. He began to walk toward the grand double doors of the ballroom, his posture straight, his stride powerful. Harrison Vance and the legal team fell into formation behind him, guarding his exit like a king leaving a fallen fortress. Behind him, the ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The lights in the crystal chandeliers suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into a dim, terrifying shadow as the facility staff, acting on Apex's immediate corporate directive, began shutting down the building's infrastructure. The security guards began moving ruthlessly through the tables, their deep voices commanding the stunned, weeping elite to vacate the property immediately. Women in expensive gowns stumbled over their own heels in the dark, crying as they scrambled for the exits. Men who had been boasting about their net worth just an hour ago were now frantically calling their accountants, their voices trembling with the realization that their bank accounts were about to be frozen by morning. Julian remained on his knees in the center of the darkened room, staring blankly at the red wine stain on the floor, completely broken, penniless, and entirely ruined. Arthur stepped out of the grand entrance of the country club, walking out from under the gold-lit awning into the cool, dark night air. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist. The valet, who was now trembling with an intense, pale terror after hearing the news from inside, ran forward, holding the door of the dented, rusted 2005 sedan open for him with both hands, bowing as low as humanly possible. "Thank you," Arthur said softly, handing the valet a crisp $100 bill. He climbed into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut with a solid, metallic thud, and turned the key in the ignition. The old engine coughed, sputtered, and rattled to life, its broken muffler emitting a low, familiar rumble. Arthur shifted into drive and pressed the gas pedal. As the old car rolled down the sweeping driveway, leaving the ruined elite of Great Oaks Academy behind in the dark, Arthur looked in his rearview mirror one last time. He didn't feel anger, and he didn't feel joy. He simply felt the profound, immovable peace of a man who knew that in the grand architecture of the universe, karma never misses a deadline.